All right, so you're here to learn more about these cyber attacks hitting Japan, right? Buckle up, because we're diving deep into all that international tension, cybersecurity, the whole nine yards. We've got some pretty insightful analysis from Dark Reading here.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about these attacks is how they really highlight how important cyber warfare is becoming in the world, you
Yeah,
know?
definitely. So what exactly happened in Japan? Like, break it down for us.
So Japan was basically slammed with a wave of DDoS attacks. DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. Basically, think about it like this. A website or online service is flooded with so much traffic that it crashes, like almost like a digital traffic jam, you know? Brings everything to a grinding halt.
Okay, that makes sense. But who's behind all this digital chaos?
Well, from what we're seeing, the sources point to a couple of pro-Russia hacktivist groups. They're
Yeah.
called No Name 057 and the Russian Cyber Army team. And they haven't just been hitting companies, they've also targeted government organizations too.
Wow. So it's not just private businesses in their crosshairs. Do these groups have, like, a history of doing this kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They've launched similar attacks against Ukrainian and European targets before, especially since Russia invaded Ukraine. It's kind of become a bit of pattern for them.
So they've got a definite agenda, it seems like. What's the impact been so far? I mean, did these attacks just take down a few websites, or is there more to it than that?
No, this was definitely more than just taking down a few websites. They went after critical industries in Japan, logistics, shipbuilding, manufacturing. We're talking potential delays in shipping, disruptions in production, possible economic instability, the whole works. This was pretty calculated.
Huh. That is interesting that they went after those specific industries. Any ideas why?
Well, it's pretty hard not to link this back to Japan's recent military buildup and all that increased defense spending. You remember that $320 billion plan they announced?
Uh-huh.
The one with those long-range missiles that could actually hit targets in Russia?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a pretty big deal. I mean, especially considering their post-World War II pacifist stance.
Exactly. And that shift definitely ruffled some feathers in China and Russia, to say the least.
So these attacks are a direct response to Japan flexing its muscles, you think? Like a way of saying, hey, back off.
The timing is pretty suspicious, right? I mean, right after Japan was doing military exercises with its allies and Russia was voicing concerns over the military buildup, then bam, these cyber attacks hit.
Yeah. Sounds a lot like a warning shot to me.
It could very well be. And I don't know if you saw this, but Nonamam 057 actually posted on Telegram directly connecting the attacks to what Japan's doing and even threatening to do more. It's almost like they're saying, we're watching you and we can really mess things up.
That's pretty chilling. It makes you think, are cyber attacks becoming like the weapon of choice now for these international disputes? Like,
Mm.
is this a new kind of warfare?
Yeah, you could say that. It's what's being called hybrid warfare now, right? They're using these cyber tactics along with their usual military and diplomatic strategies.
So it's not just about tanks and troops anymore.
Nope, not at all. It means that nations or groups aligned with them can really put pressure on their adversaries, disrupt things, and send a message, all without ever actually sending any soldiers across any borders.
And doing all this from behind a computer screen, right?
Yeah,
Much harder to trace the attacks back to the source.
exactly. It's like they've got this level of plausible deniability that just doesn't exist with traditional warfare.
So how do we even start to try and understand the motives behind all of this? I mean, couldn't it just be like some other group trying to cause trouble between Japan and Russia?
Well, yeah, you're right. Trying to pinpoint responsibility in the digital world is, well, it's a nightmare. It's not like you can just follow footprints, right? But in this case, there are some pretty strong clues pointing to Russia.
Really?
Like what?
Yeah.
Well, for one, both No Name 057 and the Russian Cyber Army team, they have a history of going after anyone who criticizes Russia or its policies. It seems like their actions often line up with Russia's interests.
So it's like there are these digital, what's the word, proxies fighting for Russia's cause online.
Yeah, in a way, you could say that. And then there's that Telegram post we talked about, the one where No Name 057166 basically straight up linked the attacks to what Japan was doing and threatened to keep doing it. It's basically claiming responsibility and issuing a warning at the same time.
Okay, so let's just say, hypothetically, Russia is behind this.
hmm
Why go to all this trouble in the cyber realm? Why not just use their regular military?
That's the whole point of cyber warfare, isn't it? They can inflict a lot of damage without leaving any obvious fingerprints. It makes it almost impossible to prove that they were directly involved.
It's like having a ghost army operating in the shadows, disrupting everything without a trace.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so hard to counter. It's asymmetrical warfare, right? A less powerful actor can use technology to really hurt a much stronger opponent.
So it's like a way for countries like Russia to show off their power without risking an actual war?
You could say that, yeah. It's how they exert pressure, influence things, and deter their adversaries, all without having to go to war in the traditional sense.
Man, this is complicated stuff. It makes you wonder if cyber attacks are becoming the go-to move for all these international disputes, where does it all end?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, as technology keeps getting better, more advanced, and our world gets more and more interconnected, the potential for cyber warfare to get really out of hand is a very real concern.
It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but this is really happening.
It is, and honestly, the scariest part is we're just at the beginning of this whole cyber arms race. As countries keep developing these super advanced cyber capabilities, the chances of things spiraling out of control, well, they just keep going up.
So what can countries even do to protect themselves? It feels like we're always playing catch-up, right?
Yeah, it's a constant back and forth, that's for sure. But there are things countries can do to bolster their cyber defenses. Investing in robust cybersecurity infrastructure is key. Things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and just making sure their personnel are aware of the threats. They've also got to develop early warning systems so they can spot potential threats as soon as possible and create response plans to minimize the damage if an attack does happen.
It sounds like international cooperation is key here too, right? Like
Yeah.
countries can't just go it alone.
Right. Sharing information about threats, coordinating responses, and working together to establish international norms and deterrence in cyberspace, that's all crucial. No single country can do this alone. It has to be a global effort.
All of this is making me realize this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's only going to get more complicated from here on out.
You're not wrong there. Cyber warfare is here to stay, and it's going to play a huge role in shaping what happens on the world stage.
Okay, so I've covered a lot here. The attacks themselves, the potential culprits, why they might be doing it, even the bigger picture of what this means for the future of warfare. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, hacktivism. It feels like that word has taken on a whole new meaning in recent years.
It really has. At its core, hacktivism is about using hacking techniques to push for a political or social cause. In the early days, it was mostly about making a statement, defacing websites, leaking information. Think Anonymous, remember them. They became pretty well known for their online protests and activism.
Yeah, kind of like the Robin Hoods of the internet, right?
Exactly. But as technology has evolved, so has hacktivism. Now you've got these hacktivist groups with much greater technical abilities. They can launch more sophisticated attacks. They can have really serious consequences. And the lines between what they're doing and actual cybercrime, well, they're getting really blurry.
So it's not just about making a point anymore. These hacktivists are becoming serious players in the cyber arena.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they are. It's not just about like website defacement or pranks anymore. These groups can actually cause some serious disruption, real damage.
Which I imagine makes it even harder to figure out how to, handle them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, traditional law enforcement, they're kind of struggling to keep up in this fast-paced world of cyberspace where borders don't really exist. These groups can be operating from anywhere, hidden behind all this anonymity and encryption. It's a whole new ballgame, and we need better international cooperation and legal frameworks to really tackle it.
So it's kind of like the Wild West out there, huh? Everyone's trying to figure out the rules.
In a way, yeah, it is. Uncharted territory. That's what makes it so fascinating, but also so potentially dangerous.
Thinking about all this, the attacks, the possible motives, this whole geopolitical chess game, it really seems like these attacks on Japan, they're more than just isolated incidents. It feels like part of a much bigger shift in how nations are interacting. Like the rules of engagement are changing right before our eyes.
Yeah, and the world is still trying to figure out how to play by these new rules. The fact that a country can be targeted and disrupted without a single soldier crossing a border, that changes everything.
It really does. And it raises so many questions like, how do countries like Japan even defend themselves against these attacks? It seems like a losing battle against technology that's constantly evolving.
It's definitely a challenge, but there are steps that nations can take to beef up their cyber defenses. Investing in really strong cybersecurity infrastructure is crucial. Things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and making sure everyone, even personnel, are trained to spot potential threats. And they need to develop early warning systems so they can detect those threats and create response plans so they can minimize the damage if an attack happens.
And we talked about it before, but it sounds like international cooperation is essential here.
Oh, absolutely. Sharing information about potential threats, figuring out how to coordinate responses, and just working together to establish some kind of international norms and deterrence for cyberspace. That's all critical. Like we were saying before, it can't just be one country going at it alone. It has to be a global effort.
All of this is making me think about those hacktivist groups again. We were talking about how the line between what they do, hacktivism and cybercrime, is getting blurry. Can you talk more about that? Like, what makes it so hard to categorize them?
Well, think about it. Are they activists just exercising their right to protest? Are they criminals breaking the law? Are they pawns being used by a nation state in a bigger geopolitical game? The answer is often a messy mix of all three.
So how do we even begin to deal with this whole complex world of hacktivism, especially when traditional law enforcement methods don't really work that well in the digital world?
That's the tough question, right? There's no easy answer. I think we need a multi-pronged approach. For one, we've got to develop more effective legal frameworks and international agreements that can really address cybercrime and hold people accountable, regardless of where they are, what their motivation is.
That makes sense, but getting all these different countries to agree on those legal frameworks, that sounds like a nightmare in itself.
Oh, it is, definitely. But we have to have some level of global agreement on what's acceptable behavior in cyberspace and what the consequences will be if someone crosses the line.
So what else can we do?
Well, we also have to remember that a lot of this hacktivism comes from legitimate grievances, you know? People want to see social and political change. So, alongside those legal measures, we need to create more ways for people to dissent peacefully and have dialogues. If people feel like they have legitimate ways to express their concerns and push for change, they're less likely to resort to these disruptive or destructive cyber tactics.
So it's about having legal deterrence and addressing the root causes of hacktivism. That sounds like a much better approach.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that this is a really complex issue and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to take legal, technological, and social strategies to effectively deal with hacktivism as it keeps evolving.
I think this whole conversation has really opened my eyes to just how complex cyber warfare is, how many layers there are to it, and the huge role it plays in international relations now. It's not just a tech issue anymore. It's about power, politics, and whether the world will stay stable in the future.
You got it. Cyber warfare is woven into everything in our lives now. It's in our economies, our politics, our security, our social movements, and understanding how it all connects is how we're going to navigate this whole situation.
So for someone listening to this, what's the one thing you want them to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to understand is that the digital world and the physical world, they're completely intertwined now. What happens online has real-world consequences, and we need to be aware of the risks, who the players are, and how it could impact our lives.
That's a good point. What happens online doesn't stay online anymore.
It doesn't. And these cyber attacks, whether they're done by nation states or hacktivist groups, they're basically a new type of conflict. They can disrupt entire economies, sow chaos, even threaten lives. We have to understand what motivates these people and work together as a global community to figure out some rules and deterrence for this new era of cyber warfare.
That's some great advice. And to add to that, I think our listeners should consider this in a world where everything is connected, where the line between the digital and physical world is getting blurry. How do we make sure that technology is used for good and not to cause harm?
That's the question we need to answer, right?
Yeah.
The future is in our hands. It's up to us to use technology responsibly and ethically.
Well said. That wraps up part 2 of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still more to explore. Join us for the final part, where we'll dive deeper into some potential scenarios that could play out as cyber warfare becomes an even bigger part of international relations. So we've been talking about these cyber attacks on Japan and how they fit into this bigger picture of global power dynamics. And it's pretty clear the digital world is like a major battleground now when it comes to international relations. So let's kind of shift gears a bit here and think about what might happen next. What are some possible scenarios we could see playing out as cyber warfare keeps growing?
That's a great question. You know, one thing that keeps cybersecurity experts up at night is the thought of a massive cyber attack on critical infrastructure. Like, imagine a nation state decides to go after another country's power grid or their financial systems, their communication networks, that kind of thing.
That sounds terrifying. What would happen if something like that actually went down?
Oh, the fallout would be massive. You're talking widespread blackouts, economies grinding to a halt, essential services like hospitals and transportation systems going offline, and yeah, it could even lead to loss of life. It would be devastating.
And the thing is, like we were talking about before, actually proving who did it is incredibly difficult. How would a country even know for sure who to retaliate against?
That's exactly right. And that's what makes cyber warfare so dangerous. There's this huge potential for miscalculations and things getting out of control. One country might retaliate based on bad information, and then, well, it could turn into a conflict that's impossible to stop.
It's a scary thought for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like this kind of large-scale cyber attack, that would basically be a huge act of aggression, almost like a declaration of war, right?
Yeah, I think most countries would definitely see it that way. And that just opens up a whole other can of worms. Like, how would the rest of the world respond? Would there be condemnation from everyone? Would there be economic sanctions? Would there be military retaliation? Those are questions we'd have to face if something like that happened.
And and let's not forget about those hacktivist groups we were talking about earlier. Their capabilities are increasing, and the lines between hacktivism and cybercrime are getting super blurry. Could they get pulled into these international conflicts too?
It's definitely possible. Imagine like a hacktivist group that's sympathetic to one side of a conflict launches a cyber attack on critical infrastructure in the other country. That could easily escalate things, and then nation states might feel like they have to get involved.
So these groups, even though they're often motivated by, their beliefs or a desire for change, they could unintentionally trigger a much bigger and more dangerous conflict.
That's right. And it just highlights how important it is to have clear international rules and laws about cyber warfare and what to do about these non-state actors. We need some kind of guidelines about what's okay to do in cyberspace and what the consequences are if you break the rules, no matter if it's a country or a hacktivist group doing it.
Okay, so we've been talking about some pretty scary scenarios here. But are there any, I don't know, more optimistic possibilities we should think about?
Well, maybe a silver lining in all this is that as people become more aware of cyber threats, it could actually force countries to cooperate more. Nations might realize that this is a threat they all face and that working together is the best way to deal with it. We could see more information sharing, joint cybersecurity exercises, maybe even international agreements aimed at preventing cyber conflicts altogether.
So instead of pulling everyone apart, cyber warfare might actually push countries to come together to protect themselves and keep the world stable.
It's definitely possible, something worth hoping for, right? It might sound kind of idealistic, but the alternative, a world where these cyber attacks are happening all the time and getting worse, where tensions are escalating and we're on the brink of global conflict, well, that's not a future anyone wants.
I think that's a really good point. We've talked about a lot of complicated and kind of scary stuff in this deep dive. The changing nature of cyber warfare, how it affects international relations, and all the ways things could unfold as technology keeps advancing. But the big takeaway I hope our listeners get from all this is that the future of cyberspace, and really the future of global security, it's not set in stone. It's being decided right now by the choices we make, the things we do, and the conversations we're having.
Couldn't agree more. If we're aware of the risks, if we understand why people do these things, and if we're willing to have thoughtful discussions about these issues, then we're taking steps in the right direction. That's how we build a safer digital world.
Well said. And to our listeners, just one last thought. As you go about your day, remember that the digital world isn't some separate thing from our lives. It's part of everything we do. And the decisions we make online, they have real consequences in the real world. So stay curious, keep learning, and be a part of shaping the future of cyberspace. And until next time, keep diving deep.